broadcast. And we are live.
An instantaneous 11, 12, 13 participants.
Yep, they were all waiting.
Do you know how many had signed up for this particular webinar?
Just shy of 300, at least the last time I checked.
Sounds like there's some interest then.
Yeah, Bert and I were talking about that when I first signed on, about how popular these seem to be and how much participation we're getting. I think it's been a fantastic thing, and I know it's been a lot of work for Bert, but I think the members and observers will really appreciate it, and I hope we continue to do this sort of thing.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we do have some plans in the works. I do not know if they are public yet, but we will be starting up something again in 2021. So in the beginning of the new year, we're going to start a different program.
There was an email about that, Bert. Yeah, so
Cool. Ooh, Maryland, Mexico City. I've not been there in a while, but it is a really cool place. New Mexico, Argentina. Ooh, more people from Argentina. Massachusetts, on the Cape. Hi, George. California, Spain, New Hampshire, Nebraska, Florida, Italy. And all over the US today. Washington, Orlando, Nevada, New Mexico, Rhode Island. I should go to Rhode Island at some point. I've never actually been there. I know it's not far, but I'm not 100% sure exactly where it is. I know it's somewhere off of New York, Connecticut, over there, somewhere.
I think if you drive south from where you are, you'll hit it, whether you want to or not.
The problem is that the way you know that you've been through to Rhode Island is you go in Massachusetts and then you go another bit and all of a sudden you see a sign that says, "Welcome to Connecticut." And you know you just went through Rhode Island.
Huh. I did not know they had good beaches in Rhode Island, but that is a good thing to keep in mind when I can actually go to the beach again. Ooh, Georgia, the UK, Australia, man, that is impressive. I don't know exactly what time it is on Australia, but it's somewhere after 2 a.m. So that is dedication right there.
Al Takeda? Hello, Al.
Milwaukee. Marine. California. Foxborough, Massachusetts. I thought that was a typo. I thought that meant Foxborough, but since someone's typed it twice, I'm assuming that there actually is a Foxborough. Which is just crazy and tells you how much I know about Massachusetts geography, despite the fact that I've lived here for 3 years. Peru, San Francisco, Finland. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that city, but kudos. Quebec. Berkeley, I noticed the person from Quebec conveniently didn't put a country. It's totally not surprising. I lived in Montreal for 4 years, and that's 100% exactly how the people in Quebec are.
Hello, Roland.
Utah. I'm sure there have been some other people from Utah, but I have not seen. I don't. That's the first time I've noticed it. British Columbia, Brazil. 4 a.m. on Australia's East Coast. I'm not sure if that's better or worse. It's closer to the morning. Hong Kong. Vermont. Ooh, Cape Town. DMV, which I believe is Washington, D.C. London, Georgia. It's always interesting to me just how many places there are. We start at 2 p.m., so technically you are early. UK, Southern California, another one from South Africa. Turkey, that's one of the first ones I've seen from there. Another one from Spain, specifically Catalonia. Okay. We started a bit early and we are now right at 2 p.m. So I think I'm just going to get started and let people trickle in as we do the little introduction. So first off, thank you everyone for coming. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to you, wherever you might be. I realize that is that some of you are coming from very far away, and so I really appreciate you getting up at all hours of the day to come and join us. Today we're going to talk about something which has been a curiosity and interest of a lot of people at the AAVSO for a very long time, and that is the idea of CMOS cameras, or rather CMOS chips. And to talk about those today, we have Richard Berry, Arne Henden, Gary Walker, and Ken Menzies. So the overall schedule is posted here. Just a couple of notes. The very first one is we'd really like to thank our sponsors. The Boyce Research Initiative and Education Foundation provides an online astronomy education, observatory resources, and research experiences to students, student teams, and schools to learn how to perform observations, conduct research, and publish their results in scientific journals, like the Journal of the AAVSO. They've been a partner and ally to us for a long time, and we really appreciate their support. Our other sponsor is ATIC Cameras. They manufacture a diverse range of quality astrophotography cameras and accessories, along with a range of free software to help you maximize the output of your equipment. For more information, you can visit their webpage. As always, links to our sponsors will be in your post-webinar email. So if you would like to visit them, all of that information will be there. A couple of things in case this is your first webinar. There are two important things. You can ask a question under the Q&A tab. Please ask your questions there. That way we have them all in one place. If you have a comment other than that, you can post it in the chat and we will try to see it. We'll try to answer any questions we get, even if they come through chat. However, it's sometimes hard to keep track of. So we would ask that you use the Q&A if at all possible. If you have any sound problems, you can go to the little microphone and check the audio settings here, and hopefully that will help you out. Unfortunately, we can't do much about the audio on our side. And without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, which is Arne Henden, who is talking about CMOS and CCD cameras compared.
Okay, thank you. Let me get this presentation up. All right, so is that up properly for everyone?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm going to be doing two presentations during this webinar. And the first one is a sort of getting you into CCD and CMOS detectors. And then the next one will be actually a little bit more of the nitty-gritty of what cameras are available. So without further ado, let's get into it. First thing you should note is that there really isn't that much difference between CCDs and CMOS. You can think of it as cars are cars. I mean, if you look at these two cars, they have four wheels, they have four doors, they've got windshields, they've got rear view mirrors, and each of these cars will get you from point A to point B. Perhaps faster or with more creature comfort than another car, but that's what a car does. And so it's what's underneath the hood that differs between these two vehicles. One is fully electric and one is a gasoline version. And it's the same kind of thing with CCD and CMOS. Both are sensor types that are based on silicon. They use a 2D array of pixels. They result in the measurement of collected photons. The difference is the method that's being used for those kinds of measurements. And so if we start off, we might have some definitions. Charge coupled device, or CCD, is also called a passive pixel sensor because it really doesn't do anything other than collect the charge and with appropriate gate level, voltage level changes, shuffle that charge down to some appropriate readout node. CMOS, which is complementary metal oxide semiconductor, is a much more complex internally arrangement, and it's also called an active pixel sensor in the sense that you can actually theoretically access every pixel individually on the device. In reality, that isn't what happens, but they still are far more capable of doing things like region of interest than a CCD is. And the other thing to note is that about 99% of all integrated circuits use the CMOS technology. And so that makes it easier for the vendor to create these devices because they can use pretty much the same kind of fab lines that they do for most of the other electronics that they may produce. And then SCMOS is kind of a subset of CMOS in that it's those sensors that have very low read noise, very high quantum efficiency, often backside illuminated or BSI, and they have very high dynamic range. And they also tend to be more expensive because of their superior characteristics. And Gary will talk much more about one of those SCMOS kind of devices. Though to be honest, most of the commercial CMOS sensors are getting into the same regime. They have many of the same characteristics today. So I want to give you some caveats though. The CMOS technology is really evolving rapidly. I mean, year to year is a long time as far as CMOS technology is concerned. And so the comments that I'm going to give here relate to the market as of today. Now, next week or next month, or if you try to look at this webinar next year or something, what I say here may not be true. And it's the same thing with what you see on the web. If you look through the web, be sure to look at the dates that each of the articles was posted, because they can be out of date very quickly. I'm going to gloss over many of the details and just generalize. And because of the rapid evolving technology, a lot of the sensor details are proprietary. And so you do not have access to a lot of the data sheets and so on. So my comments are just best guesses as to how the internal actually works. And the other thing is that even though I've been working with these things for 3 years now, I don't consider myself an expert on these devices at all. They're pretty complex, and to really make the most efficient use out of them requires delving into them in great detail. But to do the standard CCD photometry, it's not an issue at all. The current CCD status is not very good. The KAF series of sensors, like was used in the ST8 cameras and things like that, are no longer being made. As a matter of fact, the last of the vendor stock was sent out about a week ago. Sony says that they will continue making their CCDs for another few years, but in my reading, they're basically, all their R&D effort is in CMOS. Now, many of the camera vendors who do have CCD cameras realized that this shortage was going to occur, and so they've stocked up. So many of the cameras that were available last year are going to be available in the near future because they have additional stock of sensors. But I think the handwriting is on the wall. And then anybody who's doing really high-end CCD development, like E2V, will continue making their sensors for the foreseeable future because they're being used by the major observatories, and they're very expensive sensors, and so they can afford to do small fab runs in order to make these. The biggest CCD camera that I know of is LSST, or the Vera Rubin telescope, which has a 3.2 gigapixel sensor, which just recently saw first light using pinholes, and you can go on the web and see the news releases on how that camera performs. It's really an incredible piece of technology, very expensive. So the inside of a CCD and of a CMOS sensor, like I said, are quite different. If you look at this side-by-side representation in a CCD system, the electrons that are generated by photons impinging on this particular pixel get read out by moving down a column and then across on a serial register at the bottom to a readout node, which basically does the charge to voltage conversion. And then after that point, it goes into an analog output chain, which is off of the chip. So it's basically on the circuit board that may be adjacent to the CCD or something very equivalent to that. And the difference with the CMOS is that they take all of this extra circuitry for generating the clock phases on the horizontal and vertical, the analog to digital conversion and everything else, and they put it internal physically on the same silicon chip that the imaging array is on. So all the biasing, timing, serialization, A to D conversion, everything is done on the chip. So like I said, the charge to voltage conversion takes place at each pixel. The digitization of those voltages is done on a row level, in the sense that for when you're doing a readout, a particular row is selected, and then every pixel on that row has its own individual analog to digital converter. And then all that information is read out all at once. And so you can read out an entire row in just a fraction of a second, fraction of a just a few milliseconds, as a matter of fact. So it's a very fast readout. You can do entire CMOS chips in, a tenth of a second, or in the case of the really big guy, the IMX 455, which is 61 megapixels, 121 megabytes every time that you click the shutter. You can read the entire thing out in a quarter of a second. The CMOS arrays use a single power supply, so they have lower basic power consumption. The nice thing there is that it only has one voltage that you have to deal with, and so they're a little bit easier to work with. That's one of the reasons why these cameras seem to all have a 12-volt power supply into them, as opposed to what we used to do with CCDs, where you would have 2 or 3 or 4 voltages that had to be made available for the camera. And then the other thing is that very few of the CMOS cameras have built-in mechanical shutter. They all use electronic shuttering, which is inherent in the CMOS device itself. So it doesn't require an external shutter, though you can use one. So that electronic shuttering, there are actually 3 different versions of that. The rolling shutter is the one that every device implements. And that is that during an exposure, each row is reset sequentially. So row 1 gets reset, row 2 gets reset, etc. And then after the exposure is completed, row 1 gets read out, row 2 gets read out, that kind of thing. So you get an equal exposure time per row, but the central exposure time of each row is different. And so if you're dealing with something that's very fast moving, like a propeller blade or something, you can get some very weird shapes because the top of the image is actually taken at a slightly different time than the bottom of the image. To improve on that, they implemented a thing called global reset, which basically they reset the entire array all at once. And then after the exposure is finished, they read out row 1, row 2, row 3. So the starting time is identical, the ending time is slightly different, and the exposure time per row is also slightly different, because by the time you get to the bottom of the chip, it's the exposure time plus the time it took to read out all the previous rows. And the third variety, which is the one that everybody is trying to implement now, is what's called global shutter. So if you see that listed someplace, what it basically is like an interline CCD, where you have a covered area for each pixel, and at the end of the exposure, the charge that was accumulated gets transferred into the storage area and then read out. It's the best of all of the modes because it's basically really implements a true shutter, and the exposure times are identical and everything else, but it's potentially a little bit slower frame rate because of the way that the rolling shutter can be implemented. But it's slower only in the sense that instead of getting 100 frames a second, you can only get 50 frames a second. So the electronic shuttering is really important for things like high-speed imaging. Lucky imaging, the planetary observers have long adopted the CMOS cameras. Asteroid occultations, something like the Crab Pulsar, which I'll show you on the next slide, and then other high-speed research projects such as cataclysmic variables, where you may want to do sub-second integrations. However, because you're electronic on your shuttering, darks are harder. You either have to do it with a filter wheel with a blank filter position, or put a cover over the front of your telescope. And putting a cover over the front of the telescope is very hard to do robotically. So most people implement the blank filters in the filter wheel, but that means that you've lost the filter position. So your nice 8-position filter wheel now is a 7-position filter wheel. And if you implement it with a filter wheel or an OTA cover, you have to remember that it's not the same as putting a mechanical shutter on the front directly next to the camera entrance window. You do have to watch out for light leaks, and you can get them even with a filter wheel because of the way light can leak around. So here is a light curve of the Crab Pulsar, and this is 33 milliseconds long for the basic cycle. And if you think about it, that's like if you have a 1 millisecond readout, so you get 1,000 frames a second off of your CMOS camera, you actually have a 1 in 33 resolution on that light curve. So you could actually do this, and you can do it with a pretty small telescope. Something in the order of 7, 8, 10 inches can actually get a light curve off of the Crab pulsar. You just have to integrate along time. So you just build up this light curve by taking each exposure, noting what the true exposure time was through GPS or something like that, and then stacking those frames. And you can actually build up this light curve. But I don't know of a single amateur who has done this. And so it'd be an interesting project to have somebody actually do this. All right, so CCD advantages over CMOS. You use a 16-bit analog to digital converter in almost every design. I don't know of a single CCD camera today that doesn't use a 16-bit ADC. It's a mature technology. It's been used for several decades. If you use a science-grade CCD with backside illumination, you can get very high QE, up to 95%. And even on the front side illuminated ones, I've seen QEs up around 70, 80%. And there are specialized versions of the CCD. There's what's called a deep depletion CCD, which actually allows you to capture red photons better. And so for very high red quantum efficiency, such devices are available. They don't have any amplifier glow anymore. They used to, but they figured out how to defeat that. If you do binning with your sensor, you don't have any kind of a read noise hit because the binning is done on chip. You can get big pixels. 24 microns are available, though most of the science grade CCDs these days are 13 or 15 microns. Time delay integration, where you integrate as you clock the charge across the array, is possible with a CCD, but you can't do it with a CMOS sensor. And another specialized CCD detector is the electron multiplying CCD, which can actually do single electron counting. All right, so what about CCD? What about CMOS? Well, you can do very fast readouts, as I said before. On a small CMOS sensor, you can read it out in 1/100th of a second without any trouble. So you can also do extremely short exposures. So millisecond exposures are completely possible with almost every one of the CMOS sensors. Region of interest is a little bit easier in the sense that you can select individual rows. And so you can do a region of interest that is n rows in height, but then you digitize all the pixels across the row. It really doesn't save you any time. You have greater control flexibility because of all the electronics that are built onto the chip and your access to those. So you have many different read modes that the thing can run in. You can read it out in 8-bit, 10-bit, 12-bit, 16 bits. You can change the gain and offset for each one of the amplifiers on the sensor, though they're done as a global thing. You can globally change the gain, globally change the offset, not for each individual pixel. For a given chip size, the cameras tend to be cheaper. The newer generation of CMOS sensors are backside illuminated, so they have very high QE, 80, 90, even above 90% is possible. They have extremely good read noise if you compare it to CCDs. So 1 to 3 electron read noise is available for almost all of the CMOS sensors. And if you had the software, you could do true multicolor binning with one-chip cameras. Now, the disadvantages are long, but they're not insurmountable by any means. The first is that most of the current generation cameras are 12-bit. The latest generation are up to 16 bits, so they're the same as a CCD. The current generation cameras have amplifier glow except for the latest generation. The high data rates that are involved usually mean that the cameras are designed for USB 3 or fiber communication. They have no mechanical shutter, so darks are harder. the pixels are very small because of where they've come from, the cell phone technology and so on. So the pixels tend to be much smaller than for CCDs. And because they're small, they have a small well depth, except for the latest generation. They have a large number of pixels. So the ones that we're using on BSMs, for example, have 20 megapixels. And that's very common. And so if you read them out with full native resolution, you have to be prepared to have much more storage in order to archive and process the images. They have different kinds of artifacts, random telegraph noise, fixed pattern noise, pixel response non-uniformity, which are often present in CCDs but are hidden by the higher read noise. They tend to have somewhat higher dark current, but not really that much anymore. But they do have more hot pixels, at least some of the sensors, than an equivalent CCD. The read noise is coupled to the gain. So that means as you increase the gain, the read noise goes down, but at the same time, the well depth goes down. And there's a lot of black magic involved in the sensor itself and how it's read out. And so if you want to implement a different kind of read mode, it may depend just on your camera vendor whether or not it's possible, even though the chip itself is capable of doing it. So to get the sort of CCD performance from a CMOS, one of the things is that you can make it into a quasi 16-bit sensor by either binning the detector 2x2 from a 14-bit ADC or 4x4 for a 16-bit ADC, and that, by a 12-bit ADC. And so that gives you sort of 16-bit resolution, even though the analog to digital conversion used fewer bits. You can also stack multiple images. If you stack 16 images of a 12-bit sensor, you get effectively 16-bit resolution. Now, the difference with stacking and binning with a CMOS is that you increase the read noise every time you do this. So if you stack 16 subs, then the read noise goes up by the square root of 16, or 4 times the basic read noise. It was a 3-electron read noise sensor for native mode. Now you're talking a 12-electron sensor after you've done the stacking. You can reduce the hot pixels and the dark current by cooling as much as possible. So it really pays you to push the limits, and so run your TEC at 85 or 90% if it's going to be able to hold it for the entire night. The smaller full well, because of the small pixels, mean that you need to stack more in order to get high resolution, high signal noise flats. And then the real-time stacking option to stack those 16 multiple images is still lacking on most of the camera and camera software. So to finish with this, I wanted to show you a couple light curves. This is S. Ori. It's a favorite star of Frank Shore. You can see that it's a 4-color light curve from the AAVSO. The thing to note here is that all the data points that are marked with the brown crosses are from Frank Shore. And if you look at it again, you can see that they're all fairly high quality data points that match. And these are from northern and southern bright star monitors, and from CCD and CMOS bright star monitors. And you really can't tell the difference one from the other. This is A star in NGC 7790, taken on 3 nights with 2 different telescopes and 2 different CMOS cameras, not transformed. And you can see that they mesh with each other to within 0.02 of a magnitude, and the data quality is reasonably good for this particular star. So that's basically all I wanted to give you, but what I would like to do is to give you a few references of various articles and websites where people go into greater detail on particular CCD or particular CMOS and CCD versus CMOS discussions. And then there was another page of that, and those references will show up on the YouTube video so that you can freeze frame and look at them at that point. So with that, I'll end this particular presentation and take questions after all the presentations are finished.
Thanks, Arne. Next up, we have Gary talking about what a CMOS camera can do. Sorry, Gary, you're muted. You're going to have to unmute.
Okay, you should be seeing the first slide in presentation mode. Okay, I'm going to talk about pushing the envelope with CMOS. And you can see some affiliations I have there. My email address is shown here. If you have questions, don't hesitate to email me. I'll be more than happy to help you. Credits to some people who have been in either discussions or work or collaborations informally is Arne, Lou Cook, Jeff Stone, a lot of discussions with FLI, DC3 Dreams, which is the ACP software, Diffraction Limited, which is Maxim, and Tolga Astro. As a disclaimer, I've received no financial money from any of these companies. I don't consult for them. I have bought equipment and paid the prices, asking price, and I haven't gotten any special deals. So anything I say is pretty neutral and based on my experience. It is not advancing the slide.
Just click somewhere on your presentation. It's probably just not recognizing the right.
Oh, there we go. Thank you, Bert.
No problem.
So my background is I've been a CCD observer for AAVSO for 25 years. I was the first amateur to put a CCD observation in the database in 1994. Been the chair of the CCD committee in the 90s. I have 104,000 observations in the AAVSO database, and 23,000 of those are CMOS. I have an additional 15,000 additional CMOS observations over the last 3 years that are sequestered for publication. My educational background is in instrumentation. My working life, I spent working on navigation systems, reducing errors, improving the performance of things. So working with photometry is kind of a natural extension of that. I currently am the telescope engineer and astronomer at Maria Mitchell Observatory. This talk, I'm going to focus on CMOS capabilities, limitations, and upsides. Not going to talk much about theory, mostly just going to show you results, histograms, light curves, and comparisons. Arne pretty much covered why CMOS is here. Basically, it's being driven by the phones and DSLR market, and the equipment to make CMOS chips is the same to make memory chips, so it's a much better ROI, and people are getting out of CCDs. There'll always be a CCD manufacturer. Certain space programs and space pedigrees will require that. They'll probably be expensive going forward. These are some of the rough comparisons between CCDs and CMOS. Basically, the read noise is much better. The dark current can be the same or worse. The other thing you have to remember when you use a camera is the biggest contributor I found is the sky noise, and it affects the photometry almost more than the classic read noise and dark current. You just take these parameters and compare a typical high-end CCD camera and a scientific CMOS camera. You do get an improvement in the noise. The other thing I'd like to comment on is there are a lot of CCD cameras, most of them in fact, they have 16-bit A to D converters, but they're not 16-bit cameras. They don't have a dynamic range of the brightest to the faintest signal they can detect and record that's 16 bits. A lot of them are are 12-bit, 14-bit, 13-bit, those kind of numbers, and it varies from camera to camera. So don't be fooled by the fact that a CMOS camera has a 12-bit A to D converter necessarily. It may actually be just as good as a camera that has a 16-bit A to D converter, but has a lot more read noise. This is a comparison of some observations I did on a CV. It's at 15.5 magnitude. These are all 240-second exposures. They're combined B, V, R, and I exposures. They are essentially on the same telescope. One of them is a CDK-17 and one is a CDK-20. They use essentially Astrodon filters. And this is the AAVSO extended format error, the so-called Poisson errors. And in red, I show CMOS observations taken over a period of a couple of weeks. And then likewise, CCD over the same period of time. This is a high-end CCD camera. Was installed in a New Mexico observatory. The CMOS was in SRO in California, and you can clearly see for a fixed 240-second cadence, light curve, same object, apples and apples. The CMOS camera here, which is the Kepler camera, is clearly showing better results. If you don't like Poisson errors, and probably more appropriate is to take the C minus K or the comp minus check over 2 values displayed for the same data here. Here the CMOS has a bit of an advantage, not quite as much as the Poisson errors. So this is a much better indication, in my opinion, of the kind of results you get. This still doesn't include all the systematics that will show up in your light curve. If you want to break that down by color, BVRI, these are the same results. These are histograms that show the number of occurrences on the y-axis and the errors on the x-axis. And higher to the left is better. And the V observations have an advantage because of the FIPS QE response, and not quite so much in blue and IR, but still there doesn't seem to be a major difference with color. One of the things that in some discussions before buying the first CMOS camera 3 years ago is that I felt, gosh, all of a sudden we've gone from 11 and 15 electrons of read noise to a camera that has 1 to 2 electrons of read noise. But as Arne pointed out to me, you know, the sky noise is going to dominate. And so it's really maybe not going to make all that much difference. And I felt, well, that's kind of a downer, you know, this great piece of technology. So in some more discussions, what we ended up surmising is that if you were to take advantage of this low read noise and you were to stack a bunch of images, you could maybe do it without penalty, and the result might be, you know, better than we're used to seeing. So I did a bunch of analysis, and I compared a bunch of cameras, a bunch of specifications, and did spreadsheets out the wazoo. And I found that yes, indeed, that the CMOS camera could, at least the one I was looking at, optimize at about six to 8 exposures, and the CCD camera more like a single exposure. And this is consistent with what astro imagers have found, that if it's a long exposure, a single one with a CCD seems to have an advantage, but the CMOS can catch up if you're willing to do sub exposures. So we've determined it's a special technique. It enhances photometry. 2 companies now offer it in their cameras. FLI offers it in their Kepler camera, and Maxim DL offers Stack Pro in their 428p camera. It takes advantage of the low read noise. It does the stacking automatically, which is a great feature, having done it manually for a while. And I'd like to mention a caveat here. This is for a given cadence. So like if you are a as I am a time series observer, you have, based on the science, you want an image every, say 2 minutes. So do you take 1 2-minute exposure, or do you take multiple exposures that add up to 2 minutes to get a data point? There's no question if you integrate longer, you're going to get a better signal to noise ratio. I'm not arguing that. But this is that, okay, if you're doing science in this way, what's the best way? What can you get the best data with? So Arne and I work with Bob Denny of ACP and Doug George of Maxim and Greg Torrance of FLI. We had to change the ASCOM and we had to change Maxim to implement this as an automatic feature. And as I say, it's now released in Maxim 6.22. And it's also released for the KL400 camera and for the SBIG 428C camera. And I'm sure others will follow. I've heard recently that some of the ZWO cameras now offer this feature. The FLI camera offered it with their native software originally 3 years ago, but the problem is that software wouldn't work with ACP. You needed Maxim, to run ACP. So the fact that we got the ASCOM changed and everything is a big plus. So this is a comparison. It shows apples and apples, same 15.5 magnitude CV. This is 8 30-second exposures stacked on the fly, giving a total cadence of 240 seconds, and versus no stacking and a single exposure of 240 seconds long. Clearly an advantage of almost 3 to 1 here for stack on the fly. These include all BVRI exposures. If we look at the standard error, the C minus K over 2, same data, just looked at the errors a little differently. We get this comparison. And once again, here about a 50% advantage to the CMOS camera versus the CCD camera. I did a comparison with the same camera, one camera, and I observed M46 here. I did 2 routines. One, I took 10 10-second exposures and then reduced each of those and got a data point, versus a 100-second exposure and reduced that and got 1 data point. So the cadence here is 100 seconds. And I measured about exactly 20 stars in the cluster. And once again, the stacking seems to be a factor of 1.5 to 2 to 3 better. A little different on each star. I don't really know why that is. Then I did a lot of work with FLI on getting there. They use 2 12-bit A to D converters, and they use 1 A to D converter, and they read the chip twice, once with each of 2 different gains, which you can select, and then those are merged into effectively a 16-bit image. To get that all working and to get that linearity to be right and to get it to then stack on the fly with sub-exposures was a bit of a challenge. But I think we got it. And the data you see here is with the new driver with all of that implemented. And the red curve is with stack on the fly, and the blue curve is with just single exposures. And in this case, it's 120-second exposure for the single and 6 40-second exposures. Oh, I'm sorry, it's 1 240-second exposure. There's an error in this slide, versus 6 40-second exposures taken with my RC16 up at Bailey Hill Observatory in New Hampshire. Once again, some variation data point to data point. I suspect that that's probably sky conditions changing over time. But no question, stack on the fly is working here. Okay, let's have some fun with some real science I've been able to do with the CMOS camera. This is a polar, a cataclysmic variable, QQ vulpecula, that has a huge magnetic field, and so the accretion tends to align itself along the lines of magnetic holes of the white dwarf. This is the data from the entire summer prior to the fires at SRO, near SRO, which are now more or less under control. This is 7,000 observations taken over this summer, shown in gray in this plot. Shown in blue is the data from one particular night, 8/21, which 21st of August. And this is kind of typical of what this thing seems to do most nights. At the bottom in red, I've shown the C-K values over 2, and it's 9 millimags. And that's 9 millimags over the whole summer. And I have to editorialize here and say, my philosophy on throwing out data, as I heard in the PEPCA webinar a couple of weeks ago, was related that if it was more than 20 millig's, they throw it out because it's too big. Well, I don't throw anything out unless I can identify a cause. So if there's a satellite through the target star or the reference star, or there's a cosmic ray hit, or there's an airplane or something trail, or if there's a deep clouding and all the stars are low in ADUs, I'll remove those. But if I can't find a real cause, then I don't know that's not real data, and I'll include it. And so here, as you see, there are some points that are kind of high, but that's it is what it is. And so, but anyway, so the red curve gives you an idea what your real errors are in this situation. This star is reported to or suspected to be an unsteady accretor, and the accretion will change with time. And you can see that on this plot, which is the same object on the night of the 30th of August, roughly a week later. And when it's in its two bright portions of the phased light curve, you can see what appears to be quite a bit of noise. I suspect that to be unsteady accretion. It's not just general noise, because at other parts of the light curve, it's quite regular, smooth, and no noise. And then every once in a while, you get a surprise. This one shows that I get an unusual major fading of this object. And the blue curve here is almost not in the gray area. And I have no idea what causes this, unless the accretion from the whole object has now decreased for this night. And then this went away. The next day, it was back to normal. So these timetables are vitally important to determine, what the processes of these stars are. And every once in a while, you get a really big surprise. This is the same object. It's being observed by two observatories, 1,100 miles apart, one at SRO and one at First Light Observatory in New Mexico, near New Mexico skies. And this is data for a month of May. And surprisingly, during part of the month, the star has a mode that's bright at phase 0.6, and it has other part of the month, it's actually not as bright as it is at, say, 0.2. So this is sort of a mode switch that's happened to this star. And as I say, this is over a month, and if we plot here the days of the month in May, the blue are the bright mode, and the red is the faint mode. You can clearly see there's some overlap. Here I took arbitrarily 15th magnitude in B as a threshold, and then I called everything brighter than that bright and everything dimmer than that faint. So here's a process, a mode switch that's happened over a period of days to weeks, much different than the processes we saw in the previous light curve, which happened over a period of days. I should mention that this CV has a period of 222 minutes, so you get about 7 cycles a day. So even if you observe it on 2 nights in a row, you're missing, 3 or 4 or 5 cycles of the behavior. If we compare, it just so happened that one of those cameras was a CMOS camera, one was a CCD camera during the mode switch. And if you compare them, I show here the Poisson errors. Once again, the CMOS camera can clearly perform a little bit better. If you want to take stack on the fly and the CMOS camera and compare it to CCD camera with no stacking, you get this plot. This is showing the superiority of the CMOS alone and the stacking compared to neither of those two. So here the read noise is showing its real strength by allowing the stacking, which then seems to reduce the sky noise quite a bit, because I've done bench testing, and if I don't have sky noise, the stacking on the fly works very, very marginally. So there's not a lot of improvement to the dark current as a result of stacking, at least in this camera, but there's a big improvement in systematics, which has been the bane of our existence for 25 years. This is a plot. I share my telescope with Lou Cook at SRO. He tends to like to image faint things. This is a run he did on V677, and these are single exposures, 120 seconds. And the thing that's amazing to me about this is that this thing is at 21.5 to 22nd magnitude at its faintest. So in this light curve, he's gotten 0.32 magnitudes at 22nd. And this is a CMOS camera. There's no stacking on the fly here, but he did manually stack. And when he does, this is the light curve that he gets. And so he's getting error bars of 0.15 magnitudes at 21.5 magnitude. So this is stuff that he and his collaborators have not been able to do before. And so they're very excited about this. This is another plot that Lou did, unbeknownst to me. He arranged to have time on iTelescope's T24, which is a 24-inch plane wave with a spiffy CCD camera. He imaged this same object from his backyard with a 29-inch camera and I believe a 6303 chip. And then the GW20 is the Gary Walker 20-inch at SRO, which has the CMOS chip. And it's a little hard to see, but you can see the blue error bars on the biggest telescope. You can see the red error bars on T24 that are maybe half of that big. And then I'm very gratified to see that the CMOS camera with the smallest aperture, the 20-inch, only the 20-inch, has got the best error bars of the bunch. So then I got a little bit greedy and I said, well, one of the students at Mariah Mitchell was studying an eclipsing binary here, and FL Lyrae, and doing some work with Kepler, real Kepler satellite data. So I decided to take some runs and see what this setup would do. And the results you see here, the Poisson errors on the target here were less than 1 millimag. They were 0.27 millimags on the target. I defocused this thing. I had 14 arc seconds, full width, half max star blobs. Did not stack on the fly at this point. And the C minus K over 2 values were 0.7 of a millimag. And then the blue curve here shows the actual target of the eclipsing binary. And it's about almost a factor of 5 to 10 higher in standard deviation in the straight sections than either the C minus K over 2. This suggests that the target is actually a little active in addition to being an eclipsing binary in my mind. So then I decided to plot it on the same plot as the Kepler And that's the data you see here. These are 10-second averages with the ground-based Kepler versus the space-based Kepler. The fact that you can actually plot these on the same sheet of paper and the error bars don't slump, to me is kind of a victory. It isn't all perfect. This camera is a 3-year-old camera. Here is the infamous amplifier glow that you've heard about or read about if you've done any amount of reading on CMOS cameras. On the right-hand side, this is the flat field result, and it flat fields out pretty nicely. If you're an imager and you look closely at this, you won't, accept the full frame. You'd have to crop it in order to use it. It doesn't seem to affect the photometry, at all. So I think it's quite usable, and I certainly expect that going forward, these kind of things will be solved as they were with CCDs. So I have sort of a set of rules that I go by when I observe, and remember, I'm pushing the envelope here. I'm trying to get it as good as I can. You certainly don't need to do these things or the average observation if you're trying to do 1% photometry and contribute to campaigns at AAVSO. It's not necessary, but it's just my nature to go down these rabbit holes. So some of these steps may be optional. Your mileage may vary. If you're going to be successful with CMOS, I think you need to be flexible. Not everything is exactly the same as CCD. You must manage your darks. I find that every camera I've ever tested, the dark current is not linear. It's linear over certain ranges, and if you're using that range, you can get away with that. I know that on the Bright Star monitor, Arne is not scaling, and that's feasible if you use the right range. I found that the best result happens if you take your darks right before the science and of exactly the same exposure as the science. It's even possible, I haven't done it, but I thought about alternating science, dark, science, dark, science, dark, and then, to really squeeze the blood out of the turnip here. So you may mitigate the RBI or the ghost effects if it affects your science. You will see these, you take your science and then you take a dark immediately afterwards and you'll see a ghost image. You'll discover artifacts with 1 to 2 electron read noise that you've never seen before, and the first reaction is, oh my God. But get quantitative, measure the effects, see if they affect you. A lot of this stuff, as Arne said, at 15 electron read noise, you're never going to see it. But at 1 or 2, you will. The rules may change in 6 months as things evolve. Enjoy the ride and innovate. So my conclusions are that some CMOS, scientific CMOS, has higher dark current. Most of them have incredibly low read noise, and it's real. Stacking on the fly will work to mitigate the error bars in your photometry and systematics. The photometry appears to be 1.5 to 3 times better with CMOS from what I've been able to determine. The camera that I have uses a 2-gain 12-bit A to D merge to 16 bits. That seems to work well. The amplifier glow is manageable for photometry. It probably isn't for imaging. That's a different situation. The residual bulk image is manageable. It is chip dependent, and I expect that to go away in the future. I do expect future improvements in CMOS, and Maxim and ASCOM, FLI, ACP, ZWO. Auto stacking on the fly feature is released for FLI and for Maxim in Stack Pro soon, and I expect other manufacturers will be incorporating that going forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. Next, we have Arne again talking about the different cameras on the market that you can buy.
There I am. Okay, I wanted to do a little show and tell before we get started, just so that I don't have to interrupt the PowerPoint. This camera here is a ZWO ASI 1600, and you can sort of see the chip in there. It fills up almost the entire inside of the black. And then on the back, they actually have a small USB port um, to handle two devices, usually a filter wheel and a focuser. So you basically is a self-contained thing. So this is just, you know, a little camera. That's about $1,000, a little bit more than that. This is the SBIG STC 4428-P camera. I just got this in a few days ago. It actually belongs to Phil Sullivan. And I just wanted to show it to you. We do have it on the telescope. The nice thing about this camera is that all the connections are on the side. So if you have limited back focal distance, this is a nice camera to have. But these things are pretty light. This is maybe 3 pounds or something like that. And so if you've been having this worry of going to a bigger sensor, I have to beef up my focuser and so on, it may not necessarily be the case. And that one's about $4,000. And then the final one here is the QSI 600. This is the early bird special. It is a round unit, but the length of the camera is like 9.5 inches. And so you have to have a pretty good back focal distance in order to be able to support this. But this is a full frame 35 millimeter sensor on this camera, and with a nice companion filter wheel. That's about, with the filter wheel, is about 6,000, maybe a little bit more. So that's kind of the range of the commercial CCD, commercial CMOS cameras that you see on the market today, outside of the Kepler series that Gary was talking about. All right, so let me share my screen. And get this presentation underway. All right, so this is basically a description of what's available on the market today with CMOS cameras, and a little bit about what to look for and what to be aware of. And again, as in the previous presentation, the technology is as of today. There are new sensors that are being brought out every month. For instance, CWO has announced a new camera that will be coming out next year. And I know QHY have a couple. And the camera and distributor lists that I'm going to show here are incomplete. So if your favorite camera vendor isn't in here, I'm sorry. I just overlooked them. The usual camera parameter decisions that you make with any imaging system are appropriate for CMOS as well. So you have to match your camera to the telescope focal length. Your field of view, you may want to use as much of it as possible, depending on how much of it is corrected. What kind of seeing that you have so that you don't oversample, all the usual things that you run into. You notice that the cameras that I showed you have a variety of shapes. They're square versus round, long versus short. It kind of depends on what your telescope system is and what you want to do with it. For instance, if you're using a RASA type system where the camera is in the optical light path of the telescope, you may want to go with one of the round small cameras. And then there is also monochrome versus one-shot color cameras. For most photometry, if you can afford it, you would go with a monochrome camera and filters. But if you want to go on the cheap end, a one-shot color camera is not that bad. I think Rich will show you that in much better detail. If you go on the cheap end of cameras too, you'll find them that are uncooled, but with CMOS, it actually has very low dark current. Uncooled isn't all that bad. You can still do photometry with it. One of the big questions that's the topic of the day is filters and filter wheels, primarily filters. Remember, as you say, okay, well, I'm going to replace my ST8 camera with something that's bigger because I can find something that's relatively inexpensive, that is a full frame sensor like the QHY or the ZWO 6200. Well, then you need bigger filters. And the question is where are you going to find those filters? Because right now the filter market is kind of in a shambles as far as I'm concerned. I'm actually working with two of the vendors right now to produce new Johnson Cousins and Sloan filters. And so there'll be more information on that in the near future. But right now I don't want to jump the gun and tell you anything, but there is a lot of action behind the scenes. The filter wheels, I suggest that you go with the vendor of your camera for your filter wheel. It's just a lot more convenient that way. One of the other big questions with CMOS cameras and with a lot of CCD cameras today anyway is what do you do if the camera breaks? Because most of these vendors tend to be outside of the US. And if you're a foreign observer already, well, then it probably doesn't make a whole lot of difference to you whether you send the camera to the US for repair or to Hong Kong for repair. But if you are inside of the US, you'd really like to have a US vendor, a US repair shop, and that may or may not be available. And then the other question, because the technology is changing so rapidly, do you wait and keep the camera that you currently have? Or do you jump in and buy with the assumption that it may not be the best camera 2 years from now? And that's just a decision that you have to make. There are the various camera shapes that I showed you earlier. This is a little bit better pictures so you can see where all the connectors are and what the sensor sizes are. The 1600 camera that I showed you is a 16 megapixel, 4.5 micron pixel type camera, and the STC 428 is a 7 megapixel camera that basically is the same as KF 8300 type camera. And then the QHY is just really nice. But ZWO and several other vendors also make cameras based on that same sensor. So here's a short list of the kind of sensor sizes that you will see if you go out and start browsing through the various websites. And these are kind of the normal definitions for them. And the ones that people are really going for these days are the APS-C, which is the small DSLR format, and then the full frame, which is 36 by 24 millimeters. But to use a 36 by 24 millimeter sensor, you have to use at least 50 millimeter round filters. And so those are $500 a piece. So just remember, you go up to a bigger camera, you got other expenses that you have to include in your budget. Pixel sizes are pretty small with CMOS cameras for the most part. They're typically 2.4 to 4-ish microns. And that means that they're really optimized for short focal length telescopes. So if you have something that's 600 or 800 millimeter focal length, you can get a really nice match with CMOS cameras. But if you have a C14, which generally is an F11 type system, almost 4 meters in focal length, you're going to be way oversampled with the native pixel sizes of CMOS sensors. And so you're going to have to bin like crazy. Typically, if you wanted a 1 arc second per resolution element, that's an 18 micron bin sensor, which is like a 4x4 with a 4 micron or 3 to 4 micron native sensor. So binning 4x4 means that your read noise is increased by a factor of 4 from what that really nice figure that you saw earlier. So in that case, it might be better to think about using a CCD bin 2x2 or 3x3 or something like that, where you don't have any read noise hit. And actually those cameras might be available used on the open market at a very reasonable cost in the near future. Now, this is a slide on whether read noise is important. And as Gary mentioned, as long as the sky noise is reasonably high, which means an exposure that in the example here is like a minute or longer, you can actually optimally stack because all the noise is in the photons coming from the sky. And so you don't need to worry about read noise. You just stack the images and you'll get the same kind of noise figure, signal to noise ratio that you had before. Sensor companies, there's basically 3 big ones and there's a bunch of smaller ones. Panasonic makes a number of CMOS devices that usually are 12-bit analog to digital conversion, and they do have amplifier glow. Sony in their 12 and 14-bit sensors had quite a bit of amplifier glow as well. The ASI 183, which is based on the IMX 183 Sony sensor, does have amplifier glow at the level of sort of 70 counts in a 300-second exposure in certain areas along the edge of the sensor. But most of that can be taken out with appropriate dark frame. And Sony, because of the wide variety of sensors they have about 50% of the global market. And they keep innovating like crazy. The IMX 455 is just a beautiful sensor. Full 16-bit, no amplifier glow, no nothing. Beautiful. And then the G-Sense sensors, such as what's used in Gary's camera, are these ones where they have 2 12-bit converters that you then have to combine to form a pseudo 16-bit result. And they tend to have larger pixels. The camera that Gary has are 11 micron pixels, and that's kind of the size that they're going for. So they're more suited for longer focal length telescopes. They work really well for that. There are a whole bunch of camera companies that use these sensors, and I just listed a few of them here. The ones that you'll see advertised like crazy are ZWO and QHY. They tend to be competitors, and they both come out of China. SBIG has gotten into the CMOS arena now. This 428 camera that I've shown you really looks nice, and the first images off the sky are excellent. I have great hopes for them in their transition to CMOS. And some of these others, Finger Lakes makes the camera that Gary has. I think they're their only US vendor at this point of CMOS cameras. So let me go and give you some of the typical cameras for each one of these vendors. Here are 3 that are kind of from their low end up to their highest end camera. The 183 that I mentioned up there is the one that the Bright Star monitors use, and they are 12-bit cameras, 20 megapixels, but we bin them 2x2, so we only have 5 megapixels that we deal with. But notice that it's 84% QE at the peak. I mean, they're backside illuminated for $1,000. I know a lot of professionals that would have just had their mouth watering if this was available a couple decades ago. The 80–90% QE cameras I was using back then were typically $60,000 for the chip. The 294 was just announced and should be coming out probably beginning of next year. It's a 14-bit camera. It's very similar to their color version of the 294. And then the 6200 is the same as the QHY, has everything. The ZWO filter wheels tend to be pretty thin, and so you have to worry about how thick the filters are. Not all filter cells, the 1 1/4 inch cells, are the same. Some of them are like 8 millimeters high, and the maximum that you can get in a ZWO filter wheel is about 7.5, 7.4. So you have to worry about this, and you may have to trim the filter height down a little bit in order to fit them in the filter wheel without rubbing. QHY just has a whole variety of cameras. They make excellent cameras. The ones that we've used here at New Hampshire is the QHY 600. APAS is actually moving over to the QHY 600s. And there are several different versions even of that camera. There's the short and longer. The reason that the long one is available is because it has extra circuitry in it for doing a bidirectional fiber transmission. So they have 10 gigabit fiber links to the camera that you can get in the professional model. And that gives you 4 pixels or 4 frames per second, whereas going with USB 3, you only get about 2.5 frames per second transfer rate. For most astronomy, that's not an important thing. And then they're bringing out a new APS-C 16-bit camera sometime soon. Here are a couple of the SBIG cameras that are now coming out with the CMOS. Like I said, they've now started to ship the STC 428P, and it's basically an equivalent to the KEF 8300, 7 megapixels instead of 8 megapixels, 4.5 micron pixels instead of 5.4 micron pixels, but with greater well depth and with the firmware that they have in there, the Stack Pro that Gary was talking about, you can stack up to 16 images inside the camera before it gets transferred back to the computer. And I've played with that and it works like a charm. The one limitation on the current Stack Pro is that the shortest exposures you can use with that system are 1 second. So if you want to work with a very bright star, you can't really use Stack Pro efficiently. But if you're looking at sort of 20-minute exposures and you want to do 1-minute subs or something, it's a beautiful system. ATIC has a number of CMOS cameras now, and they're bringing out another one of the IMX 455 cameras sometime early next year at about the same price point that ZWO and QHY have. Then Monrovia have several CMOS cameras, but primarily 12-bit sensors for now, but they are bringing out one of the G-Sense chips in the near future in the C4 16000 camera. And the G-Sense 4040 is basically a KEF 16803 killer because it's 4K by 4K by 9 micron pixels, and with greater well depth, greater sensitivity, all the specs on that chip are better than the KEF 16803. And so those people who want a really wide field, this one requires 50 millimeter square filters, and even then you may get vignetting depending on the speed of your telescope. But if you can afford that, it's a really cool way to go. And then FLI, as Gary mentioned, he's using the KL400. There's also a 4040 and even a 6060, which is their biggest camera. And so they tend to go more for the top end astronomy market and medical imaging and what have you market. Cameras tend to be a little bit more expensive, but they're well made and with really excellent sensors. So my recommendations, if you're a beginner, if you're just jumping into CMOS or digital imaging in the first place, the one-shot color cameras aren't all that bad. And Richard will talk about that in just a couple of minutes. You can actually do decent photometry with them. You don't have to worry about a filter wheel. You don't have to buy filters. I mean, there's all kinds of advantages to doing that. And that gets you your feet in the water and gives you a good system to start with, and then you can work your way up. If you already have a CCD system and it's just getting old and can't get repaired and you want to replace it, you can actually find a CMOS camera that is pretty much a drop-in replacement. And you might think about buying something like that. They're not expensive. They're only like, $1,000, whereas the original CCD camera might have been $3,000 or $4,000. So there's a savings, though you do, but with very similar specifications. And then if you really want to go on the high end, it used to be you had to spend $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 to get a really high-end CCD camera, but now you can spend $4,000 or $5,000 and get something that's almost every bit as good. And the IMX 455 is just stunningly good. And they actually make a bigger one than that. They make a 151 megapixel camera. So almost 3 times more pixels. And I think there are a couple vendors who are actually trying to produce cameras with those. I don't know where they're going to find filters for them. That's all I can say, because you're going to need a 3-inch filter in order to be able to handle that. So in a quick summary, there's lots of choice of these cameras available. CMOS is now equivalent to CCD as far as I'm concerned. If you don't currently have a camera, then I would recommend going CMOS rather than CCD. And then really realize that if you want to wait it out for another year or two, you can certainly do so with your existing CCD camera. There are some improvements, but at the same time, if you're getting good science now, you're still going to get good science with your CCD, so you might as well wait. So with that, I'll shut it down and return control to Bert.
Thanks, Ernie. Next up, we have Richard Berry, and he's having some slow internet issues, so I will be doing his presentation for him. So if you, so the slide transition may be a little bit slower than normal, but we should get it.
Okay, thanks. I'm stuck in a place where, unfortunately, the internet connection is sometimes very good and sometimes very poor. And this morning it was very poor. Probably somebody's watching cat videos somewhere else on the system. At any rate, we recently, for a Pine Mountain Observatory observing workshop with high school students, did a series of observations of the variable star XX Cygni. And let's move on to the next slide, please. And because we had a one-shot color camera at the focus of the telescope, that's what we did our photometry with. Next slide. When you do this, you have to be concerned that the star size is not so small that most of the light can fall on one of the sensors. Okay, the red, the green, and the blue sensors have different spectral characteristics or sensitivity characteristics. So if you simply let the light fall on the sensor and the star image wanders around, you will get noise because you'll be looking at the star first in red, and then you'll be switching to green, and then you'll be looking at it in blue, and you can get fairly large variations. Next slide. With CMOS sensors, because the pixels tend to be quite small, it's not too difficult to have the star image large enough to cover a significant number of pixels. So you don't want color images for doing your photometry. What you want to do is to bin the camera. So next slide shows the binned superpixels, and the question is, what the heck is the color response here? You know, am I looking at I'm looking at some funny combination of red, green, and blue. So it's TR, TG, and TB, and some combination of those is what your response is going to look like. So we decided to attack this question empirically. The next slide shows one of about 15 nights of observations. We simply went all night long, every night that was clear with the sensor. So at the far left, you can see it's not gotten dark yet. And then the star rises to a nice maximum. It comes up. There's something funny going on with that maximum. But what was happening was that as the telescope approached the meridian, the tracking got a little bit funky, and there's a little gap there where the telescope was flipped. Okay, and then we come down and we're heading into dawn light again. So I was using an Attic Horizon one-shot color camera. I binned it 2x2. The telescope is an 11-inch Raza, so it's got small pixels and rather small star images. And so we were using it a little bit out of focus. During the night, the focus would change a little bit because it's an aluminum tube. And in order, this camera is sensitive, especially with an 11-inch aperture, and the comp stars were, I think, 10.4 magnitude. So we used a 10-second exposure time. So every 10 seconds, we're taking a new image. And that was to avoid saturating any of the color pixels with our comp stars. Next image, the next slide. So to figure out what the color sensitivity is, we simply average together 100 of the images, and I simply picked a half degree by half degree field of view and extracted the magnitudes of all those stars. So it's about 2,500 stars. And I compared that in the next slide. This is simply the AAVSO stars for the same field. And so this is simply a circle with a half degree radius of XX Cygni. So we have all the stars in that region. I think there were 3,200 stars. And I wrote a little piece of software to match up stars with AAVSO stars with the measured stars. So the next slide shows on the left the label got funky, but that's the V magnitude, Johnson V magnitude from AAVSO. And along the bottom, we're looking at the magnitude we measured from the images. And because we averaged together 100 images, the noise there is quite small. Okay, and the next slide is the one that matters. What we're doing is we're comparing the magnitude difference, one shot camera minus V. You can see where 0 is. So there's an offset. And then in the other axis, it's Johnson B minus V. So that's your star color. The red dot or the black dot at the center, that's the color of the sun. And anything to the right of that is a reddish star. Anything to the left of that is a bluish star. And given that we don't have really good control as to how well the stars match, and I've got to go back and look at that much more carefully, you can see that we have for stars who do not depart too far from B minus V of between 0 and about 1.1 or thereabouts, we have a reasonable match of the one-shot color with V, and then for stars that are red, we see a descending line running off to the right and down where there is a magnitude error. The conclusion from this, which is in the next slide, in the next slide, the assessment is that if you have large enough star images and the star color is not too red, and you're careful not to accidentally saturate the red, green, or blue, and you do this by taking some images without bending it and making sure that you're not saturating over your 12-bit limit. In fact, it makes sense to keep it down around, in a 12-bit camera, keep the ADUs down to around 3,000 or not, or higher. A Bayer one-shot color is approximately V with some offset, and you would probably want to report that as CV. It is a clear V. What this means is if you're a novice and you're thinking about getting into doing some photometry with the AAVSO, you can use your one-shot color camera and simply bin it 2x2, and use that essentially monochrome camera as a reasonable version of V or TG. It's not too far away. As long as you choose subjects or rather objects to image, rather to do photometry on, that are insensitive to the actual color sensitivity of the camera. So things like EBs and some of these fast pulsators, all we're trying to do with XX Cygni was get the time of maximum out of it, and that turns out to be not particularly color sensitive. So I would hope that if you are a novice and just getting into doing photometry, and you have a one-shot color camera and you keep seeing you should have a monochrome camera, you could recognize you can bin your one-shot color camera 2x2 and start doing photometry. There's no reason to wait. You can report it as CV because it's basically, as long as you don't do red stars, you're pretty, you've got a camera which can do good photometry, or at least decent photometry. So that's it.
Okay. Thanks, Richard. I wasn't quite sure. Next up is supposed to be a Q&A session, which we'll get to very shortly, but we have a brief presentation by Ken Menzies to talk about a direct comparison between CCD and CMOS.
Thank you, Bert. Hi to all 167 of you out there. I'm going to share my screen here and show you one slide. And I hope that shows up well. Okay, Bert or Gary, can you tell me that you see that or not?
Yep.
Okay,
You
good.
see it.
Good. I suspect that all of you out there listening have always asked the very basic question, how good is my data? That means two things to most people. How precise is my data? In other words, how consistent is it from one image to the next when I measure the magnitude on each one? And how accurate is my data? In other words, how close my magnitude is to the true or accepted or known value. And Gary showed several slides where he compared magnitudes over some time frame in a light curve between a couple of different cameras, perhaps the CCD and a CMOS camera. And Richard compared some of his numbers to AAVSO magnitudes. So he was trying to address accuracy in that sense. I've used Landolt standards because there are plenty of them available both on the equator and now in the northern southern 45-degree declination areas approximately. And since they're constant, one could ignore any of the normal variability that would occur on a regular light curve because I haven't taken my image at exactly the same time as another person has. And certainly since we're talking variables, the magnitudes have changed over time. So there's really no reason why your value and somebody else's value should be exactly the same unless they happen to be exactly the same time. So the way around that is to in fact image Landolt fields. And as I said, there are many of them. If you look at the standard fields link on the AAVSO webpage, you'll find a list of them, an indication of a field of view and a number of comps that exist in that field of view. So it's a good place to go and match to the size of your field of view and take some images of. And then you can do a simple thing, as I've done here. This is SA113, which is a 45-degree north field, because I'm in the Northern Hemisphere, where I've compared magnitudes calculated for both the New Hampshire 2 BSM CMOS camera, the ASI 183, and the BSM Texas CCD camera, which I believe is an ST10. And I'd like you to look at a couple of things here. That's the blue and the orange box. These are box and whisker charts. So they're able to give us both an accuracy number and a precision number. And you'll notice on the left, I have Landolt minus measured magnitude. That's the difference between my measurement. In this case, just to warn you, using only one comp and no transformation. And I hope that all of you, in fact, participate in the fall meeting, plug for the AAVSO fall meeting. There will be hopefully a 1/2 hour, 2 hour presentation on accuracy that Ed Wiley and I are doing. A couple of things I want you to look at. There is an y-axis that ranges roughly from minus 0.03 mags to 0.06 mags. Somewhere slightly below center is perfect agreement between the Landolt and the measured magnitude, and that's the 0 line. You'll notice that our numbers, as you would expect, don't agree exactly with the 0. Hopefully, the closer you are to the 0 perfect agreement, the more accurate your result is. That is, you agree with the Landolt magnitude. You can see here, and again, just a qualifier, this is one of the 10 stars I used in SA 113. And again, only one comparison star used for the calculation, and no transformation done. And you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, the CMOS and the CCD, you'll sit there and say, well, they don't agree exactly, and you're right. One might argue that the accuracy for the CMOS camera, the blue box, is not quite as good as the CCD red box. Well, statistically, I suspect if you look at the boxes themselves, not the whiskers, in fact, they overlap almost completely, the blues a little bit above in one small section. That says statistically there is no difference in terms of agreement between the Landolt and measured between these two cameras. So that's the first thing to remember. In fact, in the fall, I'll show you more data from more of the stars with transformation and without transformation, with one comp and with an ensemble, and show you that, in fact, there is better agreement that might be implied by this one slide. So that's the first observation I'd like you to make with this one slide. The next thing is, and is it true or not? You'll find out again in the fall. You can see, I suspect, that the blue box is not quite as large from top to bottom as the orange box. And again, this is a box and whisker, so it shows all of the individual points that went into it. And the top and the bottom of the blue box are the 25th percentile and the 75th percentile. In fact, one might observe here that, in fact, the precision, the difference from one image magnitude to another, is a little smaller than it is in the case of the CCD. Is that real or not real? So I think what I'd like to summarize with is the following statement. There is no obvious statistical disagreement between the two cameras, CMOS and CCD, at a statistical level between the observed magnitude, the measured magnitude, and the Landolt standard. That's a good thing. You've got good agreement. And perhaps, we'll find out in the fall, there might be a slightly better precision associated with the CMOS camera than the CCD. But again, one image, one comp. In fact, I will show at the fall meeting that, in fact, if you go from the different techniques for measuring accuracy, if you go from one comparison star, non-transformed, to one comparison star transformed, and if you don't understand transformation, you can look it up, or I'll explain it again in the fall, to ensemble, multiple comparison stars used in the calculation, non-transformed, to ensemble transformed. And in fact, I think what you'll see in the fall is that, in fact, there is a relatively consistent and uniform trend from the poorest agreement being the single comp non-transformed down to the ensemble fully transformed. So I hope you take from this that, in fact, there is relative confidence in a CMOS versus a CCD, and that I'm sure in the future price will determine, and in fact availability will determine what camera you end up with. So I'll stop right there and thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Now we can transition into our Q&A session. And the first question is probably for either Gary or Arne, and that is, what is the current status of CMOS linearity? so far, this has been one of the main limitations on using CMOS in science, especially for photometry.
Gary, do you want to take that, or I can certainly say for the cameras that I've tested, the ZWO and QHY cameras, they seem to be linear. There are issues down near the toe, very low signal levels. There's the usual stuff when you get up close to the saturation level. But in between, I don't see any problem with linearity at all on either of, well, of the 6 or 7 cameras that I've tested.
Yeah, I can say that I've spent hundreds of hours testing the linearity of the FLI camera, and it is at the limit of the ability to test linearity to say that it is almost as perfect as you can get. And so I don't know of linearity issues that the questioner is asking about. I would ask that they post the data or post more details. But I've got 200 pages of linear testing I've done, and it's very, very good.
Okay. Sorry, did someone else want to say something? Okay, so the next question is, this is probably a question for Arne. Do CMOS have anti-blooming gates?
Yes, they do. It's inherent in the CMOS technology. I think every CMOS sensor has an anti-blooming capability. I don't know if it's really considered a gate or not, but they all do anti-blooming.
Okay. And is this something that you can switch on and off, or is it are they all anti-blooming just by default?
I think by default. I don't know that you can switch them on or off.
Cool. Another question for this time for Richard. For the observations that you use, or for the observations that you did, rather, did you use either IR or UV blocking filters?
I think the Attic Horizon camera does in fact have a IR blocking filter, but I don't know that for a fact. It would not be a good idea to, say, put a V filter in front of a one-shot color camera, because basically the blue sensors would then become black holes with no sensitivity, and you'd probably be adding significant uncertainty in terms of having all your sensors illuminated. You have a sampling problem with the CMOS, or with the Bayer array. During our data runs, we accidentally forgot to turn on the binning a number of times. So I do have data that captures the full Bayer array, and it will be possible, although I haven't done this yet, to get the red, green, and blue filtered images out of that. I haven't done that yet, though.
Okay, a question for, actually that I don't really know who's the best to answer this, so I'll just throw it out there. And they're basically asking, can you use the Deep Sky Stacker program to stack CMOS images, frames, darks, flats, etc.?
I'm not familiar with that program, so I can't lend an opinion. I don't see why not, but.
Yeah, I don't have any familiarity with it either, but I would tend to agree. If it works for CCD, I don't really see why it wouldn't work for CMOS cameras. Okay. Here's a question regarding the one-shot color cameras. Do the OSCs have a diffusing filter in front of them similar to a DSLR to ensure that a point source illuminates a minimum of 4 pixels?
If that's for me, I think we'd have to refer that to Attic cameras. Visually looking at it, I don't see signs of it. I would expect if there were diffusing filters there, that when you looked at it, you would not see the grading effect we would see where the pixels generate a grading color. So my guess is that they do not have a diffusing filter.
So that actually,
Richard, that would mean that you just want to make sure your star is big enough to cover many pixels.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very simple to put the star slightly out of focus.
so that actually brings up a question that seems to be sort of intermittently asked here, and I don't know the answer to it. It appears there's a difference between DSLR and these OSCs. What actually is the difference definably between these two things? Because I'm not sure that I know that, and there seem to be several questions sort of relating to that.
From my point of view, the DSLRs typically have a blocking filter in the infrared or ultraviolet. So that would potentially diminish your signal at one end of the spectrum or another. That would be one difference. I don't know if one-shot cameras do that or give the whole spectrum. Got any idea, Arne?
Some one-shot cameras, for instance, from ZWO, on their entrance window, they do have IR blocking on them. And so that does exist. My understanding is that it's basically the same chip that's used in the DSLR cameras. So the difference would be in the supporting electronics around the chip as to how the data actually gets stored. I think I recall right, and somebody can certainly correct me on this, but DSLR does tend to do a bit of processing unless you store the image in raw format. And then even then, there are some cases in which it does some other things like interpolating over bad pixels or removing dark current or things of this sort, where you have more control over that if you're buying an actual one-shot color camera.
So
it'd be a matter of checking with the manufacturer to see what they're doing with their camera.
Right.
The
So-
other thing is that the DSLRs are almost never cooled. And I believe most of the one-shot colors, or at least some of the one-shot colors do offer cooling, which will reduce dark current and might affect the results some.
So would it be?
Yeah, the Attic Horizon camera is colored, and I mean, is cooled, and I typically ran it at -20°C.
So would it be fair then to say that the things that you can do with a DSLR, such as debayering and transforming, would be the same for both?
I think so.
Okay, because that should answer several kind of questions that were asked here, just from that sort of vantage point. So there's another question. Does the CCD photometry guide need any updates for CMOS?
I'll take that one, Bert. Yes. Sure. Yes. It has been given serious thought over the last year. Arne's presentations over the last month or two and his posts on the webpage, the forum, have given strong impetus to several people to think about this more seriously. Whether it is an addendum to the CCD manual, I tend to like the idea of having a separate CMOS manual. It's self-standing. Much of the same stuff would be included, of course, on how to do photometry. but the differences in gain settings and other factors like that would be specified in the CMOS guide. At least that's my druthers. Do you have any feeling on that one way or the other, Arnie?
No, I don't. I mean, if you have two guides, it means there's double the effort in keeping it maintained.
Yep.
But at the same time, it gives specific information that a particular observer is looking for. So it's always a toss-up.
Hey, I'm trying to see what the, so here's a more specific question. I'm not sure that I know enough about what it's saying to translate it. So if you guys don't know, then we may just have to skip it. But it says, I have a modified DSLR with the LFP number 2 removed. Could one do R observations as well as G? I assume due to increased band pass to unmodded DSLR, the answer is yes. I'm not 100% sure exactly what that's asking.
I think one of the real problems with all of the one-shot color and DSLRs, and this is coming from a person who's used them, but not as heavily as they should to be expert on it, is that the filter band passes tend to have big red leaks. So they do a really good job in the area that are important, but then anything that's redward of there is a real mess. And so I'm not sure whether or not transforming those things, other than the G transforming to Johnson V, the others tend to be difficult to transform if you include the entire wavelength range.
Okay. So the next question is, I understand some vendors offer the ability to bin output in hardware or software. What are the benefits / issues associated with the different binning methods?
For a CMOS array, all binning is done in software. And it may be done on chip, but it ends up being a sort of a software type function. I'm not 100% sure that's one of those proprietary things. But the net effect is that if it's bin 2 by 2, whether it's done on the chip or whether it's done in the driver, you'll still see that factor of 2 increase in the read noise.
And so here's a question, or maybe just a clarification. I think, Gary, this is probably best for you. It says, essentially what it's asking is, do you need to bin CMOS or stack multiple images to get good photometry with CMOS, or can you still do single images and get good photometry?
You can get good photometry by the simplest method of not stacking at all. The things that I was talking about, and I obviously didn't emphasize strong enough, if you want to push the envelope and you want to do less than a millimag photometry, for instance, if that's your goal, then you need to do all these things. If you're looking for 1% photometry, then most of the things I've talked about are not absolutely necessary. And of course, it depends on how bright your object is, how bright your comp stars are, what precision you're looking for, and so forth. But if you just want to buy a CMOS camera and start doing what you've always done, you'll probably be getting at least as good, if not better, results. And then if you increase your techniques, there's room for improvement.
Sorry, I have to be very careful with that. The next question is, well, I'll throw it out there. I don't know if you guys will be able to answer it specifically or not, but it says, for spectroscopy, which would you prefer, CMOS or CCD?
I think one thing you should do is to look at Christian Buell's site, because he does a lot of comparison of CMOS versus CCD, and he does a lot of spectroscopy. And so he has a couple articles on there that are really good to look at. And that's part of the reference list that I gave. And the current generation of CMOS, I mean, the ones that are, no amplifier glow and 16-bit, work, in my mind, just as well for spectroscopy as any CCD sensor. But you have to look at the details, because the microlensing causes fringing, and you get all these little effects that take place that spectroscopists are need to know and understand. And so I would recommend looking at Christian's site.
Cool. And then here's another question, which I think was technically answered, but maybe it's not clear that it would have been answered. But it says, instead of binning, what about oversampling and spreading the readings across more pixels? I think that if the cameras have an anti-blooming gate, that you can't do that, but I might be wrong. So, Arne?
Instead of binning, yes, you can spread the light over more pixels. It just means that it's basically the same for a CMOS sensor, because you're reading out individual pixels and then combining them in some way in software. And once you do that, well, then the read noise goes up by the square root of the number of pixels that you combine, and it makes no difference where that operation takes place. And so if you bin, or whether you over sample your image and then you effectively bin at the other end, it's all the same.
Yeah, I had one plot in my presentation of FL Lyri, the eclipsing binary, where I defocused to 14 arc seconds full width half max and just loaded up on photons, and the CMOS camera responded to that. I didn't try it the other way, so I don't have a comparison, but it definitely does work for that.
So a couple of questions here on the gain and the offset for CMOS cameras. Are there any specific recommendations?
In my mind, the setting you want is the one that gives you the highest dynamic range. And then after that, it's just a matter of choice. And for most cases, that tends to be with a very low gain factor. So a gain of 0 or 1 or 10 or something like that. But it depends on the project that you're interested in. For spectroscopy, you may go on the other end. You may want to have the absolute lowest read noise. And you can live with the lesser full well depth on your pixel, because you can then co-add and things like this, sum your images. So it kind of depends on your project, but in most cases, I think just shooting for the highest dynamic range, which usually means something near a gain factor of 1 electron per ADU or something like that. Depends on the sensor, but that kind of range.
I would agree with that. I did some experiments early on with setting the gain to very high levels and then very, very rapid cadence, just to see what would happen. And you find that you're doing things like saturating 15th magnitude stars, which is kind of crazy. So yeah, you want to, most of the time you're going to find working with a low gain to give you maximum dynamic range is going to be certainly the most controllable and most understandable kind of result.
Here's a specific question for Gary. Do you know if the FLIR Grasshopper cameras are going to produce Linux/Windows software for their cameras?
Oh, well, I'm not familiar with the Grasshopper camera line at all. I do know that the Kepler does have a Linux driver on the website, I believe. I haven't used it. I've just used the Windows one.
There's a question specifically on, I'm afraid I'm unfamiliar with the acronym, but someone's asking, please explain BSI. Does anyone know what that relates to?
BSI is backside illuminated.
Ah,
And
okay.
so there are, again, if you look at well, maybe not any of the references that I gave, but basically what you do is instead of having all the circuitry on the front of the sensor so that it's any incoming light has to sort of go through that or go into an area that's not covered by circuitry, you flip the sensor around 180 degrees and illuminate from the backside of the sensor. And what that means is that you don't have anything obscuring the photon flux coming in. So you have much higher quantum efficiency by doing that. But it makes it physically more difficult to manufacture. And I'm really surprised that Sony is able to do this, but they have. And so it just is a different way of allowing the light into the sensor.
So here are a couple of questions specifically on the one-shot camera again, and its ability to transform. So would you be able to transform CV to V on the binned one-shot color cameras? Is that a reasonable thing to do?
I don't know. I haven't had a chance to work with this data long enough to be able to answer that yet.
Certainly you can transform it mathematically. Whether it makes sense from a physical point of view is the other question. And you'd really just have to try it and see what the agreement was like, I think.
Yeah, I mean, looking at those, that scatter and stuff, yeah, I mean, you can clearly force those points back. Whether that means anything or not, I don't know. My biggest concern right now in working with that particular data set is making sure that the APAS stars and the image stars correspond properly. I just matched them up by right ascensions, declinations, and I want to filter that so it's nice, clean data set before I start. There was a lot of scatter, as you could see.
Okay, yeah, I would definitely recommend doing some testing before doing any transforms like that.
Yeah, Bert, even with a regular RGB filter in a DSLR, the G color matches reasonably well when it's transformed to the V. But I think Arne will agree that the B and the R potentially don't transform quite as well for most wide range of color stars.
That's correct.
And I would think that if you're a beginner, your best option is actually to try to work on projects or objects where color is not a significant issue, rather than trying to take the one-shot color camera and trying to make it do things it was not really intended for.
So we have a question for most lower end CMOS cameras, 12-bit for instance. At what sort of count rate would you expect the chip to go nonlinear?
Arne,
Yeah.
with our AAVSO 183, we go almost to 65,535 and it's still linear.
That's correct. I think we generally cut it off at about 62,000 or something like that, just to be on the safe side. But they really are linear up basically to full well.
And that's because of how they've set their gain.
That's right.
So there's a fairly intricate question here. It's an important feature between CMOS and CCD, which is important, is the fact that readout noise is stationary in a CCD instead of in CMOS array. Each pixel has its own noise attached to the current voltage converter embedded in each pixel. This may require specific NUC. What do you think about this issue? I'm not actually sure what NUC stands for. I apologize.
I'm trying to think of what NUC stands for too. Yeah, I mean, if you get down into the nitty-gritty detail, the fact that you do have electronics on each pixel does mean that you have differing bias offsets, differing noise characteristics for each of the pixels. But at the level that we're dealing with, where you're dealing with, you know, 100th of a magnitude or, you know, a few millimags, I really don't see that that's going to be a major issue. And so I think it's something interesting to study, but I don't think that it has a high impact.
The other thing is that from a topology standpoint, having all those readout amplifiers right where the pixel is thermally makes a lot more sense than having one of them or two of them on the corner of the chip, and then, you know, whatever's happening at the corner of the chip is not what's happening in the center of the chip. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's actually an advantage to have all of those. Probably thermally is what's going to drive any kind of errors with them, and as long as there's good thermal control, I wouldn't be surprised to see it be an advantage.
Here's a question for Richard. Did you try binning just the green pixels versus V for your thing, or yeah, I'm assuming the answer is no. It seems like this is fairly new.
Yeah. Let's see. I did that analysis on the 6th, I think, and we had a wildfire that stopped further work on that. So I haven't had a chance to look at the data, but we have about 25,000 images taken in that project, and about 4,000 of those images were taken unbinned. So there's a lot of data to play with on that same field. And obviously almost all the stars in the field are non-variable. So yeah, there's a big pile of data to go back and work with and try to figure out exactly what it means. The other thing is, I would point out, anyone who wants to do this, it's actually quite straightforward. You just shoot, you know, a few hundred images of any field at all, bin them up, and download the AAVSO data, and you know, do your comparison of all those stars. And obviously, you could pick standard fields also, and just do this work on the standard stars. So it's not terrifically difficult to, you know, really understand what the one-shot colors is doing. I was just doing this because I had that data and was concerned to understand whether or not using the binned one-shot color was a legitimate way to have done that photometry.
So the next question is, so CCD chips typically include overscan regions. Do the newer CMOS cameras include those, or is that a relevant thing for them to include?
Certainly for the IMX 455, it has overscan, both in the row and in the column direction. They have a number of columns, I believe, that are covered by aluminum and so are insensitive to light and can be used for overscan. And the QHY basic driver comes set up as default to include overscan. And so you can use overscan just like you would under normal circumstances with the CCD system to determine what the bias level is for the current exposure and the ambient temperature. And so it's available, but I think most people tend to throw all that data away and just use a mean bias frame and not worry about the 1 or 2 ADU offset that you might run into. So the answer is it's there, and if you feel that it's necessary to use it, you can, but you don't have to.
So there's a question for Gary. Is there anything different that needs to be done for calibrating images if you're stacking on the fly?
Nope, it all works. The one limitation for the stacking on the fly that it's implemented right now is you set the sub exposure in a text file, and you basically have to live with that until you edit that text file. So for remote observers like me who have running under ACP, whatever you choose, you live with it for a night. It would be nice to be able to select in ACP for each project different sub exposures. And of course, when you take your darks, you want to take them with those same sub exposures. And it all works. It's Peter, who did the driver, just did a marvelous job of all those little details.
Gary, from talking to Diffraction Limited, I think they're thinking about making that change, and talking to Bob Denny about it as well.
Yeah, we've been campaigning for that a little bit, and it won't surprise me to see that happen. It's sort of like almost necessary, but to be honest with you, I'm so gratified that we've got it. What we've got at this point, that I'm happy, but I'd like to have the other two.
I wanted to mention that in my presentation, I was calling cameras SBIG cameras. They're really cameras from Diffraction Limited, and they're the SBIG line underneath Diffraction Limited. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, so there's another question that asks how CMOS data should be reported to the AID. And I think that the easiest way to answer that is that it depends. If you're using a monochrome CMOS camera, then you would report it based on the filter that you're using. If you're using a color CMOS camera or like a one-shot camera or DSLR, then did you debayer the images or not? Did you bin the images? If you binned them, then you would report them like Richard said. If you debayer them, then you can either transform them to the appropriate colors or submit them as the DSLR colors, which is TG, TB, and TR. Basically, it really depends on whether you're using color or monochrome. And then, if you're using color, then you report it like DSLR. If you're using monochrome, then you'd report it like a typical monochrome CCD.
Yeah, Bert, one of the wrinkles that people get confused by on the AAVSO website is that you really only see CCD as an option for, quote, electronic magnitudes. Hopefully, I certainly in DFOT, because I've talked with George about it, putting in the word CCD next slant CMOS is a way around that. But effectively, it's a magnitude from either of those two cameras, but monochrome, yes, and as you said, using a specific filter.
And with that, I know we still have a few more questions, but we're really kind of short on time. We've already gone quite a bit over. If you have any questions, please try to put them in the forum. If you don't know how to use the forum, please feel free to email me specifically, and I'll pass it on to whoever you would like. My email is on the registration page for all of the webinars. Big thank you to all of our speakers for this session. They have graciously taken some time off on a Saturday to come and help us do this. Also a big thank you to our sponsors, Boyce Astro and Attic Cameras. And finally, even though this was planned to be the last session, we're adding one more webinar next Saturday called Celebrating Our Observers. It's going to have members from a lot of different branches of the AAVSO who are going to just talk about their experiences and do a fairly long Q&A session with maybe a few presentations. If you'd like to attend that, please feel free. Otherwise, have a great rest of your day. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Bert. Thank you for organizing this.